I'd tell you that the moon is one of the most dangerous places in space. Would you believe me? This much is certain. It seems something strange is happening with the moon because so many probes have crashed onto the moon over the course of lunar exploration that something isn't right. But NASA, the Indian Space Agency, Chinese scientists and Russia are always sending new probes to the moon. Big plans. After 2024, it is planned humans will land on the moon again for the first time in almost 45 years and study Earth's satellite in unprecedented detail. However, when you watch the record of moon missions, we have to worry about astronauts' safety. While the Russian Lunar 25 mission crashing into the moon and breaking many protocol experts' hopes didn't occur until the summer of 2023, it is one instance that makes the point. Space travel is likely too advanced and dangerous to send humans to the moon right now, experts agree. I think NASA sent almost a dozen astronauts to the moon in the 1960s and 70s and brought them all back safely. You may rightfully argue, but experts say the space capsules were safer and more solidly built in those days than they are now. The space shuttle fleet is already lost for NASA, and the agency has already had to admit that it is no longer competitive from a technical and, above all, a cost-performance standpoint. Quite simply, it has become too expensive to travel in good and safe space. Is this putting the brakes on all plans to colonize the moon? And that's exactly the case if we look at the record of failures. The great successes are deceptive. Projects such as the Apollo flights are used as prime examples of lunar research. But hardly anybody knows that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin almost died on the way to the moon. But for Aldrin being a great pilot, the Eagle space shuttle might have been lost. All billions of people watching the lunar premiere on TV only got to see the parts that worked. The first moon car, however, was carried on Apollo 15 in 1971. When the astronauts were tearing through the moon dust in the lunar vehicle, the world was ecstatic. They'd already forgotten that Apollo 13 almost killed all three astronauts. In the early 1970s, other brilliant achievements of lunar research included the Russian probes Luna 16, Luna 20, and Luna 24, which, for the first time, brought samples of the moon's soil to Earth. We celebrated the successes, but what about all the failed lunar missions? The moon missions went very well again. Since 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter had scored a goal, and 1 year later, even India's space agency had got a probe into lunar orbit with Chandrayaan-1. These two exploration spacecraft didn't even visit the moon, though. They orbited it at a safe distance from it. All of this makes landing on the moon difficult and risky, but not by that much. Much to the Indians' dismay, when their follow-up mission failed, they also had to learn this. Why did these missions fail? It's safe to say that the Soviet lunar mission in 1959 was the very first attempt to send a probe to the moon. But communications problems caused the mission to fail, and the probe did not make it to the moon. Between 1961 and 65, NASA's Ranger program sent 6 different probes to fly by the moon, but only the first 6 reached it. The first 6 either crashing on the moon or failing to transmit back. In 1969, the Soviet lunar mission failed due to technical problems and crashed on its way to the moon. Remembering Apollo 13, the famous Houston, we have a problem mission in 1970, when an oxygen tank exploded, putting all 3 astronauts in mortal danger. We've already talked about that one. After 6 days in this landing module that is far too small, the astronauts returned safely to Earth, of course, because it was pure luck. Also, the Indians themselves were hit hard, because after the good luck with the Chandrayaan-1 orbiter, the one that was supposed to get the Chandrayaan-2 lander and rover on the moon in 2019 was also hit hard. But the twin probe failed to land on the moon and crashed. What's happening here? It doesn't take an accident to happen. Space travelers should not underestimate the moon. It is a dangerous place to be. The problem with calculating the risk factor of the first is the irregular gravity on the moon. The moon's gravity is unevenly distributed, however, and the moon does not have the same gravity as the Earth. This means that gravity can come indifferent at different places on the moon. The lack of spherical phasing causes these irregularities, which require extreme precision and careful planning to touch down safely upon the surface. In 1969, The Apollo 11 mission in the irregular gravity is still the most popular example of a successful moon landing. However, as stated above, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had serious problems with moon landing. Aldrin was unable to control the system automatically, and he had to fly to the moon by hand. Although few people realize it, the landing in Mare Tranquillitatis on the moon is still considered a masterpiece of space travel, with an unfortunate footnote. Irregular gravity also had to be surmounted by the Soviet lunar 1959 and 1969 missions. Both probes came down and crashed on landing. Danger from irregular gravity remains a hard source to assess for future moon missions that still rely on it. An atmosphere on the moon is a second risk factor. Instead of our Earth's dense atmosphere, the moon has no air friction slowing down the probes as they approach the landing, as there is on our Earth. It is necessary for the probes and later spacecraft to generate that deceleration on their own in order to land gently on the lunar surface. In 1969, the Eagle lander used a thruster to slow down and land itself, gently. But depending on the lack of air resistance, there was also a failed landing. A problem with communications, or the braking mechanism, meant the Soviet lunar 1959 landing module and Indian Chandrayaan-2 mission in 2019 had difficulty landing. The third issue which defeats us in the aim of landing probes on the moon is communication limitations. Probes on the moon communicate back to Earth under difficult conditions with a long distance and limited line of sight. The prime example of successful challenge overcoming is NASA's Apollo 11 mission in 1969 again. The command module was out of the line of sight of the lander during the landing approach to the moon, during which it was in orbit around the moon, so the communication delay of about 1.3 seconds meant the astronauts on the lunar module Eagle were flying autonomously just in case they couldn't get an answer back. The Soviet Luna 15 mission wasn't so lucky. For example, in 1969 the probe was to land on the moon, collect samples, and return back to Earth. But communication problems during the descent to the lunar surface caused the probe to be lost. The Indians were also aware of these pitfalls. That's why they sent the fully automatic landing navigation system along with the Chandrayaan-3 mission, which was launched in 2023. When the probe touched down successful and softly on the moon at the end of August 2023, the whole nation was excited. Unfortunately for the Indians, it wasn't lucky. After a few days of research work, a 14-day freezing cold lunar night dawned. The two landing modules were placed to go into a dormant state that was not reversible afterward. Frankly, I am sure both probes, as the Indians eventually forgot to install. The heater froze to death, and this would have been highly advisable given temperatures of 100 degrees C during the lunar night, but this is not the end of it by any means. Another reason for difficulty in landing probes to the lunar surface is the nature of the surface itself. The moon has craters, rocks, uneven terrain. Razor-sharp or very sharp is some moon rocks. Meanwhile, the moon dust is puffy and inviting, but these are the sort of attacks you could pay for. It's not just extremely allergenic, it's filled with razor-sharp small particles. The extreme temperature fluctuations of the moon are the last point that makes it such a difficult moon. So on the moon, temperatures swing from about 173 C at night to around 127 C, as it is day for 14 days and 14 days night throughout the entire moon. From the sky regionally it burns incessantly, and then it freezes for 2 weeks. The probes face some major challenge when these extreme temperature conditions exist. A lot has to be endured by highly sensitive measuring sensors and camera systems. It was these pains which Russia felt as bitterly as the Indians now have. The Luna 22 mission, successfully landing on the moon, though Chandrayaan-3's model, had not survived the cold of the lunar night and consequently was not operational long. Now there are around a dozen broken lunar probes on the moon that probably add up to $1 billion. Will the moon eventually be Chinese property? The Chinese Lunar Exploration Program is part of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program and its missions, headed by the China National Space Administration, CNSA, has all been a success so far. The Chang'e 1 was a lunar orbiter launched in 2009 which mapped the lunar surface and gained a ton of scientific data. Exactly 1 year later, the Chang'e 2 mission followed in order to continue mapping and also flew past the asteroid 4179 Tutatis. In December 2013, Chang'e 3 was the first Chinese rover to land on the lunar surface. In 2018, Chang'e 4 was the first mission to land on the far side of the moon, followed by Chang'e 5 in 2020, which discovered massive amounts of water in lunar dust, along with the rare isotope helium-3. This brings China's total successes for landing probes on the moon into single figures, and it's also the first time for the nation to land probes without a failure. That makes the Chinese the ones with the best record of all lunar missions there are. Now we know what we know about the moon. All the failures and the bitter setbacks have taught us a lot about the moon, but not a single mission has gone wrong. The Apollo missions were a major stage in space travel, and the astronauts picked up priceless samples of lunar rock. The samples allowed scientists to reconstruct the moon's geological history. Moonquakes, or moonshakers, were struck by astronauts on the Apollo missions who placed seismometers on the surface of the moon. Their quakes also helped scientists learn about the geophysical properties of the moon and what its interior looks like. The first one to detect water ice on the lunar surface was Chandrayaan-1. This discovery can one day help supply lunar settlements. It can also be used to make fuel or breathing air. For the first time, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter produced a detailed map of the moon and found that the moon has no global magnetic field, but there are local magnetic anomalies. That data collected soon will become the basis for the moon colonization, because despite the dangers, NASA is sticking to its plans to put humans on the moon again. Never miss an incredible video, then subscribe now.